And welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm going to start with a brief biographical sketch of Catherine de Medici before the time this portrait was painted, so that then we can really go into a bit more detail about its history. Catherine de Medici was born in Florence in April 1519, which is just over 500 years ago, and she died in Blois in France Loire Valley in January 1589. She was a daughter of Florence's ruler, Lorenzo di Piero de' Medici, and his wife, Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, who was a French princess. Often within weeks of her birth, Catherine was actually brought up under the tutelage of her uncles, both Medici and both popes in succession, Leo X and Clement VII. And it was actually Clement VII who in 1533 orchestrated her marriage to the second son of the King of France, of the House of Valois. The son was Henry, and he was obviously not destined to become king. So when Catherine joined the French court, she actually played a sort of, shall we say, a relatively minor role. But then suddenly and unexpectedly in 1536, the actual heir to the throne, the Dauphin, died. So in 1547, when the King of France died, Henri became king and Catherine became Queen of France. After Henri died in 1559, three of Catherine's children would go on to become kings of France. And she, both during the time of her husband, so as Queen Consort and as Queen Mother, she took on the role as regent on separate occasions. And this was at a time, as we will see, in which France was teetering on the brink of civil war and it divided between Catholics and Protestants. Now, some of you may have heard of Catherine already, and you might have heard her mentioned as a paradigm of ambition, wickedness, cruelty, selfishness, and sort of all things evil, really. Her life, as one scholar put it, has been portrayed as a bloody phantasmagoria, full of treachery and murder. However, looking at the facts and against the backdrop of political turmoil that we're going to look at in a bit more detail, I think it is necessary really to reassess Catherine's life and her actions, especially as regent. So without further ado, I think we can begin by looking at the portrait. And Silvia, what can you tell us? I mean, where should we begin to sort of untangle the story of Catherine's life?
I would start from the beginning. And thank you, Emanuela, for this very useful introduction. It is rather complicated family history. It was a rather dysfunctional family. So thank you for summing up all these important phases of Catherine's life. So let's start from the beginning, because actually, since the beginning, Catherine found herself in a very difficult position at the court of France for several reasons. The first one was that at the time she was very young. She was only 14 years old, and she was a foreigner. She was an Italian. And especially, she didn't have any royal blood in her veins. I mean, after all, she was the heir of a family of merchants, of bankers, of only recent nobility. But and another aspect, in addition to this, was the fact that she was deeply in love with her husband, Harry, but in turn, Harry was crazily in love with a long-time mistress, the famous Diane de Poitiers, and was a rather public thing. I mean, Harry was showering Diane with gifts such as not less than the jewels of the crown, and he gifted her with this fabulous Chateau de Saint-Anceau. It's a very romantic castle in the Loire Valley. And so we can imagine for Catherine was a very, very stressful and difficult situation. But probably the biggest problem was that during the first 10 years of the marriage, Catherine didn't give birth to an heir. And in the mentality of the time, this was considered as the main function for a queen. So this was really, really a huge problem for her. But finally, in 1544, Catherine gave birth to her first son, Francis. And Francis was only the first of not less than 9 other 9 siblings, including Charles IX, that is the protagonist in this of this painting, who was born in 1550, and his brother Harry, who was born in 1551, both future kings of France. So we have to consider that really Catherine lived in an age of cruelty, wars, shifting allegiances, and often queens were seen as commodities. I mean, they were allocated here and there in exchange of political and economical favors.
Of course. And so you've mentioned two of her children, Charles and Henri. Also, I think for the audience, I know it's difficult because everybody, or almost everybody, is called Francis or Henry. And there's several, and they're from different numbers, different houses. But here we're talking about the two children, the two male sort of teenagers. There's also a much younger child in this portrait. And so, Silvia, can you tell us in a bit who all of them are, sort of the four children, not just the two, and why we know that Charles is the one, which one he is in this portrait?
Yeah, so I mean, without any doubt, the protagonists of these paintings are Catherine and Charles. In the inscription, we can read an eta sua 11th, which means in his 11th year, which means that Charles was 11 years old. And this painting was in fact painted in 1561, 1 year after he had ascended to the throne. And Catherine is here represented as regent. So, and a gesture is highly symbolic because she is protecting her son, but also presenting him to the audience, to the reign. While on his right, on Charles' right, we can see, but a step behind, we can see Margaret, the famous Queen Margot. She will eventually become the wife of Henry, King of Navarre. And on the right of Margot, we have finally Harry. Harry was the younger brother, and he will become King of France with the name of Henry III after the death of Charles in 1574. We have to bear in mind that Catherine lived, she only died in 1589, which means that she had plenty of time to actually assist to all these successions, which was quite remarkable. And actually to see again, the dysfunctional family in action with all the problems that this family, and because also the period was a very difficult one.
Of course.
While on the left, just to conclude, we have the younger son, François Hercule, Duc d'Anjou and Alençon, and who is included in this painting. Why? Because actually it was a potential heir to the throne, only that he died before Henry III. And a curiosity is that actually Catherine, that was very, very good in international diplomacy and wedding negotiations. She tried at some point to match François Hercule with Elizabeth the first, despite the difference in age. She was 49 and he was 24 or something like that. And she was quite fond of him, but obviously, as we know, it didn't work. And the two youngest, actually, François Hercule and Margot, eventually they would have become really like two thorns in the side of Catherine for different reasons. Margot because of infidelity to a husband. That was something that was going to create many problems to Catherine. While François Hercule, because during all his life, he attempted so many times to actually undermine his brother reign. So it was all the time he was plotting, and this obviously again was another reason of instability, not only outside but inside the family.
And so obviously this is a dynastic portrait. She's showing the heir to the throne, the sort of current young king, and the future potential kings. So how are we to read the significance of this portrait within the context of the French wars of religion?
Yes, it's a rather complicated story. exciting one, but it's true that it's complicated. So let's say, I mean, in order to understand the meaning of this painting, it's important to historically contextualize it. And we have to consider that this painting was painted one of the most difficult moment in the history of 16th century France, with the country on the brink, as Emanuela said before, of a civil and religious war. And the situation between Protestant and Catholics dramatically worsened during the reign of Catherine's first son, Francis II. And why? Because actually Francis was a keen supporter of the Catholic side party. And this was due in part to the fact that the Valois were Catholic, but especially because he was under the influence of his wife, who was his wife was actually Mary, Queen of Scots, and Mary, Queen of Scots, sorry, Mary, Queen of Scots, and Mary was a member of the Guise family. So here we go, we have an explanation. And things only changed when Francis II, sorry, died prematurely, and finally Charles inherited the crown, and Catherine became queen regent. And Catherine had three fundamental problems to solve at that moment. The first one, that she had to make an 11 years old boy look like a credible, strong, reliable king, which was not easy. Charles was very young, was only 11 years old, and apparently was not very much interested in politics. The second problem of Catherine was that she had to justify her own position. Why? Because in France, women were not allowed to access political authority, at least not directly. In France, there was the Salic law, and Salic law prohibited women from having political authority. So Catherine had to justify her own position. Thirdly, she had to find a way in order to preserve the Valois dynasty before it was ripped apart by the two factions, so the Catholic led by the Guise, and the Protestant led by the Bourbons. And how she did, and this is a very interesting thing, Catherine had learned, thanks to the Medici, from the Medici, how to use art as a medium to affirm political legitimacy. And in fact, is what she did, and was a kind of clever strategy, especially, as we said before, in a country where women were not allowed to exercise any power. And during the years of regency, she literally flooded the country with portraits of herself, of her children, and especially of the young king, in order to make it clear who was in power, was extremely important for her. And in this painting, as we have seen, this painting is incredibly important because it's a kind of open and powerful statement of authority and continuity, picturing the past, the present, and the future of the royal family, the Valois. And in this painting, Catherine used all, I mean, it's very clever painting, because in this painting, Catherine's gesture is highly symbolic, because she is protecting and at the same time she is presenting the young king. Catherine is presenting herself as a devoted mother, but also a faithful wife and a loyal widow. So thus justifying her own position, her own authority. And then we can see Charles IX, he has a slight smile, which translated means I am self-confident, I can be a good king, as good as my grandfather, the famous Francis I. And why? Because also Francis I was represented in a painting by Lieu with this smile. So there is a connection, and then the family is presented as a connected whole. I mean, they are all together, and they look alike, which is very important, and they gaze directly to their audience, which is again this gazing convey a sense of collective command. So we see that this portrait is really convey really a political message that actually was very much was foretells this famous grand tour that was organized in 1564 by Catherine. And during this tour, actually, the tour was organized in order to present the young king to the reign and the reign to the young king. And it's incredible. I mean, I don't know how many thousands of people, they traveled over 400 kilometers through France, and obviously organizing festival like in this nice drawing by Antoine Caron, we have one of the festivals that were organized in order to celebrate the new king. So again, we see in this painting is really full of meanings, and it's extremely important from a political point of view.
And sort of to finish off on the figure of Catherine and her role, as I said at the beginning, she has been portrayed as an incredibly sort of scheming and cruel queen. But, you know, how should we actually, how can we reassess this judgment, and should we?
Absolutely. I mean, it's actually the story itself of the making of this legend is fascinating, and the legend actually started in Protestant pamphlets during the religious wars, and especially in the aftermath of the San Bartholomew massacre, when thousands of Protestants were killed. And obviously the Protestants were looking for a responsible, and Catherine was the perfect target. Again, she was a foreigner, she was a woman, and as we said before, power didn't have a very clear framework, so she was really the easiest target. And as we see in this strange painting representing the Louvre, and Catherine is represented like observing the corpse of the dead Protestants. Obviously, the painter was a Protestant. So, but this is just to give you an idea of the.
Maybe we can sort of also specify the context of the massacre. It happened on the night of Saint Bartholomew in August 1572, after the celebrations for the wedding of Marguerite, whom we see in the painting at Strawberry Hill when she was younger, and Henry of Navarre, whom you've mentioned earlier, from the Protestant faction. So this was actually Catherine trying to find a way to reconcile the two factions. Exactly. And this attempt was obviously absolutely ruined by the massacre, by what happened immediately afterwards. But as you said, there is no evidence that Catherine was responsible.
No, exactly. And as historians, I mean, many historians have demonstrated during the last years, the legend is definitely an exaggeration and a misconstruction, and reality was definitely more nuanced. Especially, it's important to say that legend actually really took hold during the 18th century, and Walpole himself actually was persuaded. I mean, he strongly believed in the myth of the weak Italian queen, as we can see in his correspondence. So 18th century was really the starting point. And but in fact, as we say, reality was more nuanced, and we have to consider that Catherine was really in a very difficult position at the time. Was a difficult, as we said, the country was on the brink of a civil war, and she needed to defend children's claim to the throne, and at the same time she was trying to pacify this country. So what has been later described as her scheming, being manipulative, etc., was only a way to find a viable policy for the Valois in order to survive in a time where, I mean, the political background was made of wars, was made of conflict, was made of shifting allegiance. So there is an explanation, there is a kind of historical explanation that justifies own acting. And in the end, I mean, new historiography has reassessed position, and actually now, I mean, there is that we are not prizing her, but it's true that she, at least she tried to find a compromise between the parts.
Thank you. And so I think we can move on to sort of consider the painting itself in more detail, starting from the fact that we know it was painted in the studio of François Clouet. So what do we know? So who was Clouet, very briefly, and also what do we know about Walpole's acquisition of this portrait?
Yes, so François Clouet was the son of another painter, Jean Clouet, from southern Netherlands, and both Jean and François were the court painters, and probably the most famous, I mean, the leading master in drawing and painting portraiture in Renaissance France. And Catherine was often, I mean, she was very fond of François Clouet, and she commissioned many works to him. And among everything, she was also an avid collector of his drawings, incredible drawings. I mean, he depicted basically most of the members of the French court at the time. So the drawings are really a very interesting and important source of information about Renaissance France. And Catherine actually, because of the dimension of this painting, because of the political message conveyed by the painting, we are almost certain that this was a royal commission, and the painting was produced also because of the feature of the children. We are 100% sure that the painting was produced in François Clouet studio. Now, about Walpole, is a very interesting story, because Walpole actually, this painting is mentioned for the first time in Walpole description, published in 1774. And what is important is that Walpole was able actually to correctly identify all the sitters, which is quite important, and especially that he was able, actually, his attribution to Janet. Janet was the nickname of Clouet father and son in France. And so they were known as Janet, and often they were indicated as Janet, like if they were the same thing. But it's quite remarkable that Walpole was able to attribute the painting to the right painter. Why? Because at the time, Clouets were not very well known. I mean, especially outside France. Mm-hmm. And in England, they were often confounded with Hans Holbein the Younger. So it's in itself is something that is worth noting, that Walpole didn't make a mistake. The other thing we know is that he purchased this painting from this man, Mr. Bide from Hertfordshire, and he paid £25 for the painting. That was quite a huge amount of money. Yes, for the time. And the painting, as we can see from this watercolor, was displayed in the main gallery at Strawberry Hill. Unfortunately, we don't know a lot about the provenance of this painting and how it ended up at not at Strawberry Hill, it ended up in England, which is amazing because it's such an important painting for the history of France. So it's amazing that it ended up in the UK. There are a few hypotheses, but I mean, a proper, let's say that proper real archival research has yet to be done. So probably we'll have an answer in a few, I hope in a few months, who knows.
Well, now that, you know, it's come back home, in a sense, you'll have more time to research it and sort of look at all the possibilities.
Exactly, is my hope.
And speaking of the home, well, obviously one of the homes of this portrait at Strawberry Hill, how, you know, we've mentioned that Walpole was familiar with the work of Clouet, but were there any other works also connected to the Medici and the Valois in Strawberry Hill in Walpole's collection? And also, how does this portrait fit into his collection and into his view of art, really, of the history of art?
This is a very interesting topic, obviously, from a Strawberry Hill perspective, because Walpole lived in a time when, for the first time, actually visual sources were considered in the same way of archival documents. is an era in which portraits, coins, inscription were finally seen as important elements in order to understand and to study past civilization. And during the 18th century, there were many antiquarians like Walpole, actually, who began to write new national histories, including this time also the visual arts. And especially portraits were considered very important because they were thought to reveal the true characters of the historic sitters. So they were really, collectors were very, very keen on historic portraits. And at Strawberry Hill, as we know, Walpole enacted a number of historical narratives through the display of these portraits and other treasures. And Walpole was chiefly interested in the power, and this is a very interesting subject, in the power these objects had to reconnect us to the past in a lively way. And for example, Strawberry, as we know, that there is a room called the Holbein Chamber, and this chamber was filled with Tudor's memorabilia and portraits, which is quite astonishing because I think it's one of the first period room ever conceived. But Walpole was not only interested in English history. As we know, Walpole traveled extensively. He spent 1 year in Italy during the Grand Tour, especially in Florence, and also many. I mean, he spent different periods in Paris, where we know he was a friend of Madame de Fan, one of the most famous salonières at the time. And so, I mean, somehow in France and in Italy, he got, he met local antiquarians, local historians, and he got to know about local art history and national histories. And there was a moment he even thought about writing an history of the Medici family. So we can easily understand that all these interests, new interests, were reflected in his own collecting. And I think he was especially interested in the Valois and the Medici families. Why? Because these families were famous for their art patronage, and Walpole was very keen on artistic pedigree. And so here I just choose 3 of these, I mean, kind of representative objects. There was this famous parade armor that Walpole bought in France, and he thought it to be Francis I parade, which is not true, obviously, but actually he bought it at the Crozat sale in Paris, and he spent a huge amount of money to get it. Or on the right, we have this vase, which is a Medici vase with a ring as a symbol of the Medici family that was bought. This vase was bought in Florence. And again, at the center, we have a dagger, a famous, is a lost dagger, is a dagger, a very precious one that was a Strawberry Hill and was thought to be Henry VIII dagger. So again, we can see we have a series of objects which were linked to these families, and which at Strawberry Hill could help the visitor to actually visualize the history, the past history, the Renaissance history of these countries.
Fantastic. Thank you, Silvia. And I hope that you will all visit Strawberry Hill and go see the portrait in situ as soon as we can go back to museums again. And thank you very much for joining us.